Social Studies 20, taking a look now at ultranationalism and genocide. In our last lesson, we talked about what are the features, the characteristics of ultranationalism. We talked about things like expansionism, fascism, and so on. What we'll do today is look at genocide, mass murder, as one of the characteristics that goes with ultranationalism. And if we were to plot the things that can go wrong when nations pursue ultranationalist foreign policies, we might get a spectrum that looks something like this. Um, while there's no good that comes from it, probably the least of your concerns would be that there's going to be ethnocentrism. When we compare ethnocentrism to the other things that can go wrong, that this might be the part that is not as bad as the others, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So nations that are ultranationalist in nature usually are also ethnocentric in nature too. And that means that you believe that there is superiority between your culture, your society, and other cultures in society. Ethnocentrism will in turn often lead to acts of discrimination. I mean, after all, if you think that you're better than others, you may have a prevailing attitude that is discriminatory to those that you think you're superior to. Uh, Quite often, these acts of discrimination can become legalized too. So we'll study, for example, in Germany in the 1930s, um, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish thinking led to the legalization of laws that openly discriminated against Jews. They weren't allowed to own property. They couldn't own land. They couldn't vote. Their rights as citizens were stripped away legally by the German government of the 1930s. So ethnocentrism will often lead to acts of discrimination. Um, that may in turn lead to what we call internment. We'll spend more time looking at this later on next week. But internment means that you're rounding up the unwanted segments of your population and you're interning them somewhere. You're basically holding them prisoners. Usually in concentration camps, they're quite often forced labor camps. In some cases, they become death camps like we saw in the Holocaust of the 1940s. So it doesn't always have to percolate into internment, but quite often it does. The confining, the ghettoization maybe of the population that you don't want in your country, if this country was ultra nationalist in nature. Internment doesn't have to lead to conflict and war, but in terms of our look at the spectrum, conflict war would be a huge disadvantage, something that can go really wrong with pursuing ultranationalist foreign policies. So I'm thinking, World War I, World War II as examples of conflict and war coming from ultranationalist policies on our spectrum. And as we studied, war is catastrophic. War costs human lives. It is very expensive economically. It sets your country back for years, and that's even if you win the war, let alone lose the war. And someone has to lose the war, I guess. And then probably the worst thing that can happen when you pursue ultranationalist foreign policies as a country is acts of genocide, mass murder, or ethnic cleansing. So none of this spectrum is good. None of the things on the spectrum are good things that you'd want to see. But probably compared to the rest, genocide would be the worst that can happen when nations pursue ultranationalist foreign policies. And that takes us into the lesson for today. Chapter 9 is a look at ultranationalism and genocide. Uh, Genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass murder. I wouldn't say they all mean the same thing, but they all result in the murdering of a population based usually on ethnicity, maybe language, maybe race, religion, and so on. Genocide is not a new thing, so it's not an experience that was born out of the 1930s. It had always been there as a tool of war when nations fight other nations. The concept of wiping out another population, wiping out another ethnicity to the point that they can never come back and be a threat to you again. There have been a lot of genocides, ethnic cleansings. Um, these are just some. This gives you an idea. It's been around for a long time as a tool of warfare. We probably haven't seen the last of it, I'm sorry to say. These are just some historical examples. Sacking of Carthage by the Romans. Carthage was a North African city-state. that was sacked by the Romans in 146. Uh, Killed all the people in the city state. One of the more unknown ones, and one of the biggest ones, would be the genocide of First Nations peoples um, due to smallpox, war, starvation, and so on. Armenia, Cambodia, we'll learn about Rwanda in 1994. Um, so ample evidence of ethnic cleansing, genocide as a tool of war. It doesn't happen in just any ultranationalist state. There need to be a few things in place, historically, for feelings of ultranationalism to percolate into acts of genocide and ethnic cleansing. There needs to be extreme nationalism, and you probably saw that one coming. Extreme love of one's country, of one's people, of one's ethnicity. Usually it's coupled with political instability. And by that, I mean the government may not be a strong government. People might not be happy with their government. In other words, this doesn't just happen to any country. Something's got to be really wrong within your nation for this to become a genocide, an ethnic cleansing. Almost always it is the hands of a fascist government, um, elitism, ethnocentrism that goes with that. We've already talked about that. And finally, a new one that we haven't really mentioned, there's a perceived threat to the existence of this nation that people love so much in an ultranationalist state. And this perceived threat is coming from within. Quite often, there really is no threat. In fact, when we think about it, when we study genocides and ethnic cleansings, there never really was a credible threat from within that nation state, but rather the government invented a perceived threat to the existence of the nation. And this was done to deflect criticism on the government. So usually ultranationalist governments will invent an enemy within that country to focus people's anger and resentment. So if there's something wrong politically with the country, if something's wrong economically, they don't want people in that country fighting each other. They want to give them a target. So they create a threat. They create a scapegoat or an enemy, and they say, listen, you want to be mad at something, be mad at them. Go after them. And by doing that, the government gets off the hook for being blamed for anything that might be wrong in that country. And this is a very, very dangerous tool that ultranationalist governments use because you're inventing a threat, and you're basically turning your population on that threat, knowing full well that it could turn into ethnic cleansing and genocide. The results of all of these precursors would be that you have dehumanized your threat. And by that I mean that people have come to hate that threat so much they don't even see them as people. And if you don't really see them as people, it allows you to rationalize what you're going to do next, which is the mass murdering of that threat and that people, the cleansing of the threat altogether, which is easier when you don't really see them as people. So there's going to be a lot of propaganda. There's going to be a lot of indoctrination that would go along with an ethnic cleansing and a genocide. Examples we'll look at are listed at the bottom: Holocaust, Holodomor, Rwanda, and the Japanese experience in Nanking, China in the 1930s. There are, in fact, 8 stages of a genocidal model that have been put together, and I'm quickly going to take you through them. Genocides will follow these stages, and you can almost see them as they happen when we study history. Stage one is the classification. There's an us and there's a them. Um, and that is dangerous because the us versus them is usually based on ethnicity, nationality, maybe religion, maybe language, whatever it might be. Um, but the us versus them is a dangerous way of looking at things because as soon as you label people the them, you're insinuating ethnocentrism. You're insinuating that you're better than them. They're not like you. They don't belong. They don't fit in. And as soon as you're saying us and them, you're now marginalizing the people you're calling the them. They're going to be politically marginalized. They're going to be economically marginalized. Um, what you're really doing is making them into a scapegoat, and that becomes stage number two, which is the symbolization of the them, of the perceived threat or the enemy. And so quite often you will use names to describe the targets. In the 94 genocide in Rwanda, They referred to the Tutsi as the cockroaches or the tall trees. They gave them names. They gave them symbols to help dehumanize them, which helps with stage three, which is the dehumanization of those people. Again, you equate them, you compare them to things that are undesirable in life, vermin, rats. What you're trying to do is you're trying to get your population over the revulsion to murder. You're going to be asking them at some point to conduct this mass murder, this genocide. So you want to dehumanize the enemy, so they're not really thinking they're killing people. Um, Coupled with a lot of hate propaganda. Um, News, radio, TV, newspapers, all propagating this threat, dehumanizing the threat internally to your country. And then the government begins to organize and plan the genocide. Usually they use the militia. As we studied the militia, our locals are just civilian people that you have armed and maybe even trained to a certain degree. Usually, very often, the government itself will not conduct the genocide. They will rely on the militia because the government wants to give the appearance of being legitimate. They want to be able to say, well, it wasn't us, it was someone else. It was a radical extreme group within our society that did this, but don't be blaming us. We are a legitimate government. Perhaps you're even going to call themselves democratic. Uh, but stage four is the planning, the organization. How are we going to do it, and who's going to do this? Stage five is the polarization. And so what happens here is that extremists begin to step in and maybe even take over. And they drive the us and the them even further apart. Quite often in this stage, they pass laws that forbid the mixing of the us and the them, intermarriage between the us and the the them, interaction between the us and the them. Uh, and quite often at this point, too, they begin to target and go after the moderates. And so what I mean by this stage is that, even if you were living in a society like this and you were part of the us, but you weren't really into it, you didn't agree with what they were doing, what they stood for, you didn't want to partake in the murder, you would be a moderate. And they might even turn on you because you're not going along with these extreme policies of ethnic cleansing and mass murder. So um, not saying anything, not getting involved, could have exposed families to genocidal acts in the past because they didn't go along with the crowd. They didn't go along with that wave of radicalism and extremism. They were moderates. Stage six is the preparation of the death lists. So believe it or not, they begin to they take down names, they write down addresses of where the targets will be, where we're going to find them when we finally decide to unleash this wave of mass murder. I had read that in Rwanda in '94, classrooms were building seating plans where the Hutu were on one side and the Tutsi were on the other. So when the extremists finally did arrive, they would know exactly what part of the room to find these people in. Neighborhoods were mapped and plotted out. So when they do decide to give the order, it can be done fast, it can be done quickly and efficiently. Stage seven is extermination. This is the actual act of the genocide, mass killings. Again, because of the propaganda, indoctrination, they wouldn't really view it as murder. They're exterminating people that aren't really human. They are subhumans. So um, it takes away, feelings of murder and criminal acts when populations conduct this. And then finally, stage eight, believe it or not, after the extermination mass killing has occurred, um, this would be the denial that it ever even happened. So parties that partook in this would dispose of the evidence. They would intimidate the witnesses or make them disappear altogether. Believe it or not, they would often try to blame the victims for the genocide. And they would block the investigation, and quite often they take off. Certainly the people that conducted the Holocaust in Germany and in the Nazi Germany, the bulk of them escaped any prosecution. Most of them were never caught. They fled. They took on different identities. They lived among us and even maybe do up until this point. But stage eight is the denial stage of a genocide, of a mass killing. So there you go, eight stages that you can almost watch and label as they happen when we study genocides.